Physiowebseries Shoulder Complex Season 1. Let's begin with Series 3 Study of the Bone Clavicle. Let's have an overview of the bone clavicle, its attachments and the joints formed. Clavicle or collar bone is the only long bone which lies horizontally in the human body. Clavicle has superior surface, inferior surface, anterior and posterior border, medial end which is the sternal end as it articulates with the sternum, lateral end which is the acromial end as it articulates with the acromion process of the scapula. It can be divided as medial 2/3 part and lateral 1/3 part. Joints formed with the clavicle. Clavicle at the medial end forms a joint with sternum, which is called as sternoclavicular joint. In the same manner, laterally it forms joint with acromion process of the scapula, which is called acromioclavicular joint. Let's have a look at the attachments of muscles at the clavicle. Upper trapezius attaching at the lateral end of clavicle at the posterior aspect or posterior border. Anterior fibers of deltoid attaching at the lateral end of clavicle at the anterior aspect or anterior border of the clavicle. Sternocleidomastoid attaching at the medial end of clavicle. Similarly, subclavius attaching at the medial end of the clavicle and pectoralis major also attaching at the medial end of the clavicle. Other than this, there is sternohyoid muscle which can be seen here attaching at medial end of clavicle and going to insert to the hyoid bone. To brush up the same thing, we can have a look at this diagram. Sternohyoid attaching at clavicle medial end, sternocleidomastoid attaching at medial end of clavicle, pectoralis major clavicular head attaching at medial end of the clavicle, subclavius attaching at the inferior surface of the clavicle. In superior view, we can see there is attachment of trapezius and deltoid at the lateral end of the clavicle, where trapezius is attached posteriorly and deltoid is at the anterior border. At the medial end, on the superior surface, there is attachment of sternocleidomastoid and pectoralis major. Sternocleidomastoid is at the posterior border or aspect and pectoralis major at the anterior aspect, as we have seen earlier. Apart from this, we can see that subclavius can be seen or appreciated on the inferior surface of the clavicle as it has its attachment over here, and also the sternohyoid muscle at the inferior surface and the posterior border of the clavicle. Ligaments attached to the clavicle. Acromioclavicular ligament. It is present between acromion process of the scapula and the clavicle at the AC joint or acromioclavicular joint. Another one is the coracoclavicular ligament between the coracoid process of the scapula and the clavicle. It has got two parts, conoid ligament and trapezoid ligament. Now let's move on to clinical aspect, including the fracture of the clavicle. So, clavicle is the most commonly fractured bone. The common site of fracture is at the shaft where medial 2/3 of the clavicle meets with the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. This is because of the change in the curvature of bone, and It may be caused due to the transmission of the weight of upper limb to the clavicle. So, mechanism of injury can be fall on outstretched hand or direct contact force to the clavicle.